This is part 2 of improving at skills. So in the first video, the main idea was that it takes a crazy amount of effort to get really good at things, and a lot of times it's way more than people actually realize, like especially if you haven't done it before. And even if that effort is really inefficient, a lot of times you still improve and you still learn things as long as you keep trying. And then even if you have really efficient effort, usually it still takes a lot of time anyway. So I would consider it the essentially the first hurdle that you have to get through is that you have to be able to put in enough effort. And if you can't do that, then you'll probably never get really good at what you're trying to get good at. So, like the fourth point says, you have to be able to keep your motivation through any setbacks or through any feeling that you're not improving or not improving fast enough. And something that happens a lot of times is that people set unreasonable expectations and then they get depressed when they can't meet them and then they kind of give up because of that. So that's something you want to watch out for. And there's actually a lot more ways that these types of unreasonable expectations cause problems and negativity, but that's not the focus point of this video, so I'll leave it for another time. Now, the main point of this video is efficient effort. So it is true that not all effort is equal, and if you just do something over and over, you might get stuck and you might not improve. You might not improve that much. And if your effort is efficient, you can usually improve a lot faster. And then the specific method that you need will depend on the task you're doing, of course, and also on the person doing the task. And I would say that figuring out an efficient way to improve is a reasoning task, and I think it's a really difficult one. And I think it's one of those ones that, like, people tend to set unreasonable expectations about this too. Like, they think it's not that hard, but it's actually, I think it is really hard to figure out how to improve efficiently. So I'm going to talk about two types of progress. One of them would be internalizing a known skill through repetition. So you know everything that you have to do, you just have to be able to do it, and then maybe be able to do it consistently or be able to do it faster or things like that. And then the other type would be strategy type things where you either have to learn new information or learn how exactly you do a skill when you don't know specifically what you have to do. So first, talking about the internalizing part, um, a lot of it is going to be just repetition, but there are some things that you can do that might help. So one type of thing that could help is if you can identify any patterns in the types of mistakes you make. So I'll go through one example here. So timing in rhythm games is something where usually you know what you have to do as long as you can understand when you're supposed to hit the notes, then you know what it is you have to do. But it's of course difficult to do it consistently and do it perfectly all the time. So it might feel like you just have to keep doing it over and over and it's hard to do much else, but one way that you can maybe improve faster is if you can find some kind of pattern like always being too fast or always being too slow, or it might be a problem with a certain timing sequence where you might have a fast triplet and then you hit the second note in the triplet too fast and the third note too slow or something like that. Or it might be a certain button sequence, like I play DDR, and if you have to press like up, left, down in DDR, you have to rotate from up to down, and maybe you can't do that fast enough, so you tend to hit the down too slow or something like that. So if you can find some kind of pattern like that, then it gives you something to focus on that can help you improve faster. But there are a lot of ways to find patterns, so it's a really difficult thing to do because it might just be um, only for one section where the pattern applies, or it might be like a certain combination of things where it's like a certain timing sequence along with a certain button sequence causes you to get something wrong. So it is really difficult to find the correct pattern, but if you can find one, it can give you something to focus on, and it can help you fix a mistake that's hard to otherwise improve on. Now, another thing that might help you internalize things faster is sometimes you actually have to take in more information or um, use something else as well. So, the example I have for this would be like fighting games and anti-airs. So, a common theme in fighting games is that um, if the opponent jumps at you, your character usually has an anti-air move which will hit them out of the air, and especially in certain game types, it can be like guaranteed to hit. But if you don't do it, then the opponent will have a pretty big advantage and will either like force you to block or land a really big combo. So it's a big deal if you can hit your anti-airs or not. So if you're just trying to learn how to do it, you might think that you just have to practice staring at the character and then seeing them jump, and then you press the button. That's the anti-air button or move. And sometimes, though, if you can take in more information, like recognizing habits or situations, that can make it a lot easier. So, an example is a lot of people will just jump as soon as they get in the correct range to jump. So, um, you don't actually have to like stare at them and then react to them jumping. You can actually just see when they're getting into the range to jump, and then you can already be ready in advance. So it actually makes it easier to do it, and you don't just have to rely purely on reaction. And then some other examples would be like sometimes after people block a certain move at a certain range, they tend to always jump at you. So that would be another example where you don't have to do it blindly. You can take in more information, and that'll make it easier. Now, um, there's some caution points about internalizing. So the big one is there often is a limit to how much you can gain through analysis like this, and it's very difficult and it's easy to get wrong. And especially with internalizing, I'd say the big focus point is that you usually just have to do it a lot, do it over and over and over. And you don't want to overanalyze and not practice. So, um, if you were going to err on one side, it's better to practice too much when you're trying to internalize something and not analyze at all than it is to like overanalyze and not actually practice. So, especially with internalizing something when you know what to do, um, practicing really is the important part and just repetition. And then, like I said, it's easy to get wrong because maybe there's no real pattern, or you don't see the right pattern, or it's an unrelated problem, like with the timing and rhythm games. Maybe you're not able to read the notes fast enough, so that causes you to not be able to get the timing right. So maybe you hit the notes too late, but it's not because you don't know the timing, it's because you can't read the notes fast enough. So there might be an unrelated problem that causes you to find the wrong pattern or something like that. Now, for the other type of improving at something, for the strategy side of things, or learning how to do a skill that you don't really know how to do, um, one way that you can get better faster is if you can find key focus areas. So that'd be like key points that you just focus on and make sure you do those things well. And if you can find the really important ones, that can speed up how fast you improve. But if you get it wrong, or if you focus too much on something too small, then that can have the opposite effect where you kind of slow down because you're not focusing on the right thing, or focusing your focus point might be too narrow. So this, I would say, is also a tough reasoning problem to try to figure out what it is you really should be focusing on. But overall, across pretty much the majority of skills you're going to try to learn, especially like the gaming related ones, it's all going to be about processing a certain type of information faster. And because it's so broad, it's not necessarily that useful, but you would want to try to um, take that and then apply it to whatever specific game or skill you're trying to learn. So if it's like a puzzle game, you have to be able to read the board state faster, and then you have to be able to read the next pieces and see where you're going to put them faster and things like that. And if it's like a game like chess, you have to be able to read the board state in chess faster, like what's being attacked, what can you attack, what's being defended, what kind of strategies are applicable in the certain situation, things like that. So if you can come up with points to focus on, then a really good thing to do is to build practice exercises around them. So if you can make focus practice exercises, a lot of times that's even better than just like doing something and reviewing it, because that's usually a good strategy, but um, sometimes if you have the right thing to focus on and you can build practice exercises around it, that can be even more helpful. So you'd want to create those exercises around the key points, and then you would have to make sure that the difficulty of the exercise is based on your ability. So the better you are at picking it up and the faster you're improving, the harder you should make the exercise. And on the other hand, if you're really struggling with it, you should make the exercises easier. And so you want it to be like kind of challenging, but not flat out impossible. So if you can create those practice exercises and balance out the difficulty well, that can be really helpful for improving. Now, another point is generalizing new information. So you're, um, you're going to have to continue to learn new things, and gain more information, but the information you take in has to be generalizable to more than just like one specific instance. And in general, that's done by understanding how and why. Like, why, uh, why would you make a certain decision in a certain situation, or what do you need to take in to be able to make that decision yourself? So instead of just like getting an answer of like what you're supposed to do in a certain situation, you really have to understand why do you do it so that you can apply it to more situations than just the one. And if you're able to do it, figure it out on your own, then you can do that as well. But sometimes that's pretty difficult to do. So um, the way I would say it is, if you have to ask the same question again, then you kind of didn't generalize what you learned the last time you asked it. Now, that's actually really tough to do because a lot of times situations can get really complex and things like that. So you're going to have to ask the same question again. But you should kind of have that mindset where if you have to ask the same question again, then you're not really generalizing the information you learned and remembering it and applying it to the next situation you encounter. So you don't want to focus too much on just one situation. Like something I see in Mahjong a lot is people will find one situation that was either like really hard or a really bad outcome occurred, and they'll focus only on that and they'll say, what should I have done in this really hard situation? Or what should I have done when this really bad outcome occurred? And then someone will give an answer and then they'll be like, okay, that answer makes me happy. But it's not really enough to like generalize. Like the answer might not be enough or enough to provide the person with enough information that they can generalize so that they don't have to ask the same question again. Now, this point is about strategy versus execution. So, most skills you learn are going to have both of them, where the execution is like the internalizing stuff I was talking about. So, most skills you try to get good at are going to require some of both. Like, you're going to have to learn how to do it, you're going to have to learn new information and strategy about ways to do it better, and then you're going to have to repeat doing it until you can execute it perfectly and execute it faster and things like that. So most skills require both, but some they're generally going to lead towards one or the other. So something like playing a rhythm game a lot of times just comes down to execution. So some of it will be you have to understand how you hit the specific notes, maybe, and how the timing is supposed to go. Like DDR has certain like gallop steps, so you have to understand how those work. It has crossovers, so you have to understand how those work. Those would be kind of strategy type things or information gathering things. But once you know how to hit the notes, you just have to be able to actually do it and do it perfectly and do it every time. And then on the other hand, something like maybe solving a Rubik's Cube would be a lot more about strategy and information gathering. So you would have to learn a lot of techniques and keep learning more techniques and more algorithms and things like that. But once you know all of those, then it would come down to execution. But until then, it would require a lot of knowledge. So um, the important part about this is the second point where you might stop progressing if you're not improving in your like strategy and knowledge. If you're not improving in that area, that's when you tend to stop actually improving, even if you keep doing something over and over. So with a rhythm game, it doesn't have so much of the strategy stuff. So just doing it over and over and over oftentimes is enough to keep improving, even if you never think of any strategy type things. But for something else, like something I've seen in fighting games is where some people they'll like have really good combos and clearly they've practiced those really well and done them a lot and they're very good at them and they play pretty seriously, but they always do like the same strategy and so um, they just like never actually improve even though they keep playing over a whole bunch. They never really um, learn new approaches or new strategies, and they don't actually get much better. So, if you don't, um, if you don't think about the strategy stuff at all, and don't ever change that part, then it's kind of easy to get stuck and never improve, really, even if you keep doing something over and over. Now, there are some caution points too, just the general advice, just because, like I said, I think it's really difficult and so it's easy to get wrong in a lot of different ways. So, one way that you can get it wrong is evaluating a decision purely by the outcome. So, that's something you don't want to do. So, just because a very bad result occurs doesn't necessarily mean that any specific decision leading up to it was very bad. So, especially in anything that has any type of random chance or any type of unknown variables like what the other person might do or hidden information or things like that. If there's anything like that at all, then the outcome, like a bad outcome, might not mean that you made a bad decision, and a good outcome might not mean that you made good decisions. So you have to be able to evaluate the quality of the decisions you make and it can't be purely by the outcome. So it's still useful to take the outcome into account, and you can think about it, and it can be helpful to consider, but it's not the only thing that tells you whether or not the decisions were good. So it's tough, but you have to be able to figure out, were the decisions that were made good or not, even if that, like, regardless of what the outcome was. So something that can go wrong is just repetition without any goal at all. So like mindless playing, or another way that you can do it that might cause you to not really improve as fast as you could is if you set your goal too low. So if you're like not a part of a competitive scene or something, like when I played DDR, I didn't know anything about anyone else who played the game. So my goal was like beating the hardest songs in the game, and that was kind of it. And people who are really competitive at the game don't just beat the hardest songs, they like get full perfects on the hardest songs or things like that, or they go for full marvelous on the hardest songs, or the songs that are harder than the hardest songs when I played. So if your goal isn't high enough, that can be another problem. So if you just repeat things without a goal, or without a high enough goal, even a lot of times you can either end up repeating bad habits or you don't learn anything new. So that can cause you to stall out, kind of. So I did mention this before a little bit, but you can have the wrong focus point, or your focus point might be too specific. So you might get too focused on just one idea or one way of getting better, and then that's all you do. And then you might stop improving overall, because most skills you try to learn are going to have a lot of different aspects to them and a lot of different ways to improve at them. So if you focus too much on one thing, you might not improve overall. Now, this one's pretty big, where it's more of a mindset thing, though, where a lot of times people end up focusing on results over quality, and you don't want to do that. Now, I understand if you're playing like in a big tournament match, it is a one-time deal, and you really just want to win, no matter like how well you or poorly you play. You just want to win the one game, and that makes sense. But you don't want to take your like everyday ranked matches that you just play to get better. You don't want to take those like that. You really want to focus on quality of play over the actual results. So, especially in like ranked systems, a lot of times people will get so focused on that temporary rating where it'll like go up a little and then they'll feel good, and they'll go down a little and they'll feel bad. And then that can cause a lot of different problems, like playing for rating only, where you like do things like um, play the rating system. So like you maybe you can avoid playing people stronger than you and only play people weaker than you so that your rating goes up, or a lot of things like that. And then you're not actually like playing to get better, you're just playing for that temporary rating. So that's not a good mindset to have when you're trying to actually improve at something. So you don't want to like get too into the result. You want to get into the decisions. Like you want to, if you're making good decisions, even if you're like losing a lot, you should be happy, because that means you should be playing well. You should be doing whatever it is you're doing well. And even if the results don't show it right now, in the long term, they will. And if you're just making poor decisions, even if you end up winning, that's something that should be concerning to you, because in the long term, you're probably going to go down if you keep doing that. So, this one's pretty interesting, and I made a video related to mahjong about this, but I think it applies to a lot more things. So the idea is that there is a surprising amount of variation that is possible, even at high levels in a lot of different skills, where you might think, in order to be really good, you have to do exactly what the really good people do. You have to copy them exactly. But I think that's not as true as people expected it to be. So there are differences in the ways of learning, and people also have different ways of thinking. And I think that if you force yourself to try to think like others do or act like others do, sometimes it'll backfire. So I have an example with fighting games where when I was when I wasn't that good at them, I used to think that the only way I would ever get good was to be like to have a more aggressive mindset because that's how a lot of the people that I watched who were really good were. And when I played, I was so defensive that um, I could see all like it wasn't working out for me. So I thought I have to force myself to be like other people, and that was really hard to do, and that really didn't work that well for me either. But eventually, when I got really good at one fighting game, what I found out was that I was able to make my own way of thinking work for me. So it still has its weaknesses and it still has its problems, but I found ways to make it really strong as well. Like, I didn't have to force myself to think like other people do or play like other people do. I was able to make my own mindset and figure out how I could turn that into strength. So um, I'd say at least keep it in mind that you don't always have to force yourself to do the things that other people do or think the ways that other people think in order to make yourself better. And there is the point, though, that sometimes being different doesn't actually work. So, again, it's really tough to actually um, figure out what's the actual truth and what's actually necessary. Because sometimes you actually do have to just do what everyone else does. But I think a lot of times you don't actually have to, and people might be surprised about that. Now, I kind of mentioned this a little bit before too, but overanalyzing is a problem. So, really, I do think just doing something is often the best thing that you can do. Just do it a lot. And then I think a lot of people have a good sense of how to improve even without thinking everything through. They kind of just fill it out and they just have a sense of what they need to do. And I think for people like that, trying to analyze everything might actually be even less effective than just not actually thinking about it and just kind of feeling out what it is that you have to do. And then there's always the point that no matter how good your training plan is, you're not going to get better without actually training. and and I would say that I think most people do tend to get good at things without necessarily analyzing everything. I'd say that's the normal thing that happens. So people get good at things and don't necessarily know why, which is the next point. So being good at something doesn't necessarily mean that you know why you're good at it or how you got good at it or how other people can get good at it. And in the same way, even if you know why and how, even if you know how to get good at something and you know why people are good at it, doesn't necessarily mean that you're actually good at it. So you can be really good at something, and I would say a lot of people are, like, without having the correct ideas about why they're actually good at it or what it is that makes them really good at it. And on the other hand, I'd say if you think of like professional coaches for pro sports, like a lot of them aren't necessarily the best players, but they really do understand what the players have to do to get better or to win the game or at the sport. So they understand how to improve, but they aren't actually good at doing the sport themselves. So both cases are possible. And really, knowing how to be good at something is not necessary for actually being good at it. And so it's just something to keep in mind. And then you would want to refine all of this for whatever task it is that you're doing, or however you think or learn. So this is all very general, which means that some parts aren't going to apply well to everything, and you have to take the parts that do apply and apply them to the skill you're trying to learn. And again, you have to adjust for your own strengths and weaknesses, and sometimes take into account the way that you actually think about things. So it isn't really that one method fits everyone. You kind of have to adjust for the person and the task. Finally, slow progress is often normal, and so if occasionally you're not really improving, even though you're practicing a lot, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're doing anything wrong. Especially as you get a lot higher in skill, you tend to improve a lot slower. So um, you don't want to freak out and think that you're doing everything wrong and you need to do a lot of analysis and all of that. Like, it really is normal to just kind of improve slower as you get really good. So that's all of this video, and I hope it's useful.